Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Juvenile Instructor from January 15th, 1900. So what we're doing right now is we are going through a series of biographical articles that appeared in the Juvenile Instructor for every issue for about 2 years. So we have lots of material to choose from. This particular one is called Lives of Our Leaders, the Apostles, George Q. Cannon. So if you're not familiar with who George Q. Cannon was, at this time he was a counselor in the First Presidency. I believe he was the first counselor, and that's why he had the second article on him. Lorenzo Snow was the first one. Also, George Q. Cannon also served as first counselor in the First Presidency under John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow. So he and Joseph F. Smith served for years in the First Presidency. Now, this is actually shortly before his death. He died in 1901. Just a couple months before Lorenzo Snow himself. So, anyways, that's a spoiler alert because that's not going to be mentioned in this article. But it's quite a long article. It's at least as long as the last one I read. So let's just dive right in so we don't dawdle today. Through the merciful kindness of the Lord, people who dwell in this age of the world have the inestimable privilege of receiving instruction from the words and example of living apostles, whose inspired testimony is added to that of apostles of ancient times, in forming a body of Scripture to call our minds to the saving principles of the gospel. It is therefore fitting to open this paper with a character sketch of President George Q. Cannon, as he was seen by one who knew him first as an apostle, in the discharge of the duties of that high calling, and who describes him then and since in that capacity. This pen picture was requested of Elder John Nicholson, who says, "My first meeting with George Q. Cannon was in the city of Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1862, on the invitation of several brethren of the local branch of the church. I accompanied them in a friendly call upon him at the house at which he was stopping during a brief visit to the Scottish capital. He was at that time presiding over the European mission. I was then a youth of 22 years, and afflicted with diffidence amounting to embarrassment in the presence of strangers, and therefore on this occasion confined myself strictly to the exercise of observation, listening to the conversation and replying tersely to questions directed personally to myself. I was at once struck with the strength of the personality of the distinguished visitor, a handsome, vigorous man of 35 years, a figure of medium height, well-rounded and erect, the shapely head crowned with a liberal growth of black hair, the cheeks and upper lip clean-shaven, the chin adorned with a close hirsute growth. Okay, up to that time his was one of the most striking faces I had seen, a forehead broad and high, the breadth of being specially observable in the upper section, a somewhat large aquiline nose almost approaching the Israelitish in contour." That's a very interesting way of saying that. Israelitish, like he has a Jewish nose? Okay, sure, if you say so. A well-formed mouth without rigidity and with an expression of amiability. The large, clear, gray eyes impressed me most. In the course of conversation in which he took the lead, the characteristic mobility of his countenance was exhibited. My acquaintance with the subject of this personal sketch covers the period from 1862 to the present. At times it has been close, notably while he was at the head of the Deseret News establishment and editor of that journal, commencing in November 1867 and continuing for several years. Necessarily, I had opportunities of becoming familiar with many of his traits. One of these was his regard for detail and appearances. While presiding in Europe, he insisted that the clerks employed in the office at Liverpool should write with neatness and legibility. All those who worked under him in that capacity became excellent penmen. The importance he attaches to appearances is not only apparent in his own unvarying personal neatness, but in his requiring, under proper circumstances, the same condition on the part of others. Hence, in the missionary field in Europe, he directed that every elder should be clad in a full suit of black, a clerical cut and surmounted by a tall silk hat. wow. I don't find it strange that someone in the first presidency would be interested in appearances, because I think being so much in the public eye, you kind of have to be to a certain extent. I do find it interesting that that he wanted them to all be dressed in black. Okay, if you say so. I'm not sure why. That seems a little strange. But hey, whatever floats your boat, I guess. Frequently, when a group of missionaries arrived, he would commission one of the office clerks to take the lot to a clothing establishment where they were thus equipped. Oh, that's kind of cool. So if a missionary came into the mission and didn't have the black suit that he wanted them to have, then he would take them shopping. That's kind of cool. Occasionally, but rarely, some of the boys from the far west objected. One of these is now a bishop in Idaho. While the latter labored abroad, he insisted on dispensing with the use of suspenders, in wearing a suit with some semblance of antiquity and not the regulation cut or color, and a somewhat asymmetrical article for headgear. Brother Cannon sometimes good-humoredly referred to this unconventional but really estimable individual. Okay. Okay, so he didn't condemn people if they really didn't want to wear it, yeah? Okay, that's fine. President Cannon is a gifted speaker. In his earlier experience, he was much more deliberate in utterance than later in life. In this, he showed his usual fidelity to detail. If he happened to make the slightest error in grammar, he would there and then correct himself by repeating a sentence. This was noticeable in the first discourse I heard him deliver. It was on the subject of the necessity of continuous revelation, which he explained with striking clearness. For many years he was ranked among the foremost public speakers of the nation. Added to his wide range of information and deep and sometimes tremulous earnestness, he has been aided by a clear, resonant voice. He warmed to his theme. He has, on occasions, reached the highest flights of oratory, thrilling and captivating his auditors by the forcefulness of his thought and the persuasiveness of his address. That's not the meaning of the word auditor, but okay, sure. There never was a man within the range of my acquaintance who could so readily as he adapt his speech to convey important thoughts to the minds of little children. This is one of the rarest gifts. It is natural to him, and he developed it to a high degree of excellence by cultivation. Hence his speech had a wide applicability, ranging from the undeveloped children to the most cultivated audiences of mature people. His addresses have been far from being confined to the theological and moral subjects, but have embraced a wide variety of themes, including civil government and other matters associated with the general well-being of humanity. He is an intense lover of little children, in whom he takes a deep interest. This trait has always been manifested in his visits to families. He never fails to give a liberal share of attention to the little ones, with whom he pleasantly converses. In this capacity he has exhibited marked tendencies of memory by calling each child of a household by name, after a lapse of 2 or 3 years between the former and a later visit. His love for and interest in his own progeny are hardly exceeded. The patriarchal instinct prompts him to group the members of his family and their branches around himself, he being the center of the aggregation. The wisdom of this is apparent. It is the process of patriarchal populous expansion. Its perpetuation means an incalculably wonderful result. So long as the organization and solidification are preserved, the accretion must necessarily be ceaseless. Yeah. Accretion is basically means accumulation, yeah, but on its own, right? This practical effect of his personality is but one of the numerous evidences of the communal tendency of his thoughts and far-reaching character of his ideals. It must not be supposed that Brother Cannon's interest in and affection for children are merely of a centralized character. On the contrary, these sentiments are, with him, decidedly expansive. His work at the head and front of the Sunday school system, now so conspicuous a feature among the Latter-day Saints, places this beyond question. He took hold of this labor when the enterprise had scarce an existence as an organization. Now it extends to every settlement where the saints are found, and has numbers of scattered branches in the nations abroad. I have no idea that this beneficent establishment has its equal in completeness and efficiency in the world. The spectacle presented by the Jubilee celebration held in the Tabernacle, Salt Lake City, October 8, 1899, was of such a character as to impress any intelligent beholder with this thought: who can count the number of precious souls whose feet have been directed and maintained in the path of rectitude and salvation by the agency of this great institution? If the subject of this sketch had performed no other work in life than that which he has accomplished in connection with the Sunday School cause, it would entitle him to have his name handed down as a benefactor to the latest generation. What he has produced under the blessing of God through this agency radiates beyond the limits of time and stretches into eternity, where the multiplication of its effects will parallel duration. Some of the phrases back in the day just don't quite make sense. Like, you're not using that word correctly. Effects will be unparalleled, is what you want to say. Like, will parallel duration doesn't make any sense. Whatever. All right. The man about whom I write has been conspicuous for the strength of his personal magnetism. As a rule, he captivates those who come in contact with him. The influence of his personal atmosphere has not only been felt among his co-religionists, but has extended to all classes of men whom he has met in the world. I should say that he is a natural statesman. This has been virtually admitted by national characters of this republic. While he occupied the position of delegate to the Congress of the United States from the territory of Utah and since. While acting in that capacity, he showed his usual appreciation of the necessity for familiarity with details. Not only did he acquaint himself with the functions of government and the features indicating the limitation lines between its different departments, but likewise with the names, constituencies, and some personal particulars regarding every member of each branch of the national legislature. He was therefore regarded by his contemporaries in that body as a kind of individual intelligence bureau. When any one member made inquiry of another about some particular senator or member of Congress, it was by no means unusual for the gentleman interrogated to say, "I don't know." "Inquire of Mr. Cannon from Utah. He seems to know everybody." This species of information was doubtless useful to the gentleman who possessed it. As a rule, men are pleased when they observe evidences of being remembered. Running through the career of this striking character are strong evidences of his adherence to duty as he has understood it. This ideal has been sustained under circumstances that have demanded at the time much personal sacrifice. His responses to calls made upon him by his superiors in office in the Church of Christ have been prompt and unhesitating. I have found in my observation of men this statement of Carlyle to be unqualifiedly correct. Great minds are respectfully obedient to all that is over them. Only small souls are otherwise. The standard of the subject of this sketch in relation to charity has always been of the highest order. His exalted ideal in this respect has not only been exhibited in his public and private teachings, but without doubt is personally exemplified in his entire mortal career to the present. This eminent position regarding the most important subject that occupy human contemplation has undergone in him but a single change, a modification in his views in relation to those who have not practically occupied the same elevated moral position as himself. Has Brother Cannon exhibited faults? Ask me if he is human. Imperfections are the lot of humanity. Where there is light, there is shadow. The more brilliant the light, the deeper the shadow appears by contrast. The failings of mere men of the world pass without notice, while the defects of individuals conspicuous for great qualities appear abnormally large by immediate contrast with their opposite. In this case I should not speak of imperfections. They should be buried in oblivion by the overwhelming weight of his virtues. That's interesting that they specifically said that. I wonder what he means. Like, has he exhibited faults? Well, of course he has. Everybody has faults. But like, wow, like that's hinting on something going on in the background without outright saying it. I wonder what he's talking about. It says that in this case, I speak not of imperfections. They should be buried in oblivion by the overwhelming weight of his virtues. In other words, he did something. I'm just reading between the lines here, so I don't know if this was really meant, but it sounds like he's saying that there was something that he did that this writer found not so great, but that he's willing to overlook it based on the fact that George Q. Cannon did so much good in his life. I wonder what it was. Maybe, it might have just been something personal that he found weird, but that isn't really weird. It was just his own personal opinion. But, that makes me look twice and be like, whoa, what did he mean by that? I don't know. I hope nobody says that about me. Jeez. Ugh. That's not a nice thing to hear about yourself. I wonder if George Q. Cannon read that and was like, oh, I know what he means, Ah, it's so weird. All right. In the previous issue of the Juvenile Instructor was a live sketch of an apostle whose term of service in that eminent position is longer than that of any other man now among us, President Lorenzo Snow, who became a member of the 12 more than 50 years ago. President George Q. Cannon, first counselor to President Snow in the first presidency of the Church, is the second of those now living in point of years' service since entering the Council of the Apostles. This is his 40th year since being called to meet the responsibilities of the apostleship, and he is the 25th person selected to occupy a position among the 12. He was a young man when the summons came, and while he has reaped the benefits of experience and ever-increasing knowledge, he has not become aged in the common application of the term as it relates to the intellectual vigor, the devotion, the inspirational power, in brief, the intelligence conferred by the Almighty to meet the exalted requirements made of his servants. George Quayle Cannon was, okay, now we're getting to gosh. Okay, I'm sorry. My personal preference when it comes to biographical articles is that they go in chronological order. But we had a basically 4 or 5 page expansion about his character, and now we're getting into facts about his life. That's really strange to me. Okay, George Quayle Cannon was born in the humbler ranks of life, not among the lower classes, for his parents had a wealth of uprightness, honesty, integrity, probity, and Christian devotion, which made them respected and esteemed in the community where they dwelt. They were honored for their worth by the people, good and true, with whom they associated. The date of birth was Thursday, January 11th, 1827. The place, Liverpool, England, and his parents, George and Anne Quayle Cannon, were natives of Peel, Isle of Man, the family line being traceable to the island for centuries back. Interesting. Isle of Man, huh? In early life, George Q. was a careful reader of the Bible. By the knowledge thus acquired of the dealings of God with his children, there was laid the foundation for a deep and abiding faith in the ruler of the universe. As a youth, he had wept for the privilege of witnessing the mighty works of the Savior and his apostles, and he noted that the gifts and blessings enjoyed anciently were not manifested among the various denominations of Christendom. The faculty of thoughtful determination between teachings and practices was of inestimable value to him in after life. It is one too often neglected in cultivation by young people, whose failure in this regard limits their powers of discernment. Its use enabled George Q. to recognize more readily than would have been possible otherwise a system of religion that conformed in practice to the Bible plan. His aunt, Leonora Cannon, had moved to Canada, and there became the wife of John Taylor. Oh, I didn't realize he was related to John Taylor. Interesting. So he's, okay, one of John Taylor's wives, I'm assuming his first wife, is George Q. Cannon's aunt, so he's her nephew, yeah? Okay, then a Methodist local preacher. When the gospel was carried to Canada, John Taylor and his wife received it, and the former ultimately became president of the church. In 1840, Elder Taylor was one of the Latter-day Saint missionaries sent to England, and during his preaching there, the Cannon family were among those who investigated and accepted the divine message, realizing that it was the plan of salvation taught by the Savior. Okay. What's interesting is that I always thought of John Taylor as having a British accent. He might have. He was born in Britain, but he lived in Canada from the time he was relatively young. I think it's more likely that George Q. Cannon had a British accent than that John Taylor did. It's interesting to think about. Anyways, so it does make sense to me also that John Taylor would immediately go to the Cannons as being related to his wife, and so he would be confident of getting a good reception there. So yeah, he basically baptized his wife's entire family, Leonora Cannon. The family started for Nauvoo in 1842, and Sister Cannon died on the way, being buried at sea. I wonder which Sister Cannon they mean. Do they mean Leonora Cannon, like John Taylor's wife, or do they mean like George Q. Cannon's mother? See, I'm not sure which Sister Cannon they mean. They need to be more specific there. 2 years later, her husband passed from this life. Okay, well then it must be his mother, yeah? And the children were left without mother or father. Hang on, 1842, how old was he? 1842, 1827. Oh gosh, 14? 15, okay. I can add, yes. Okay, so he was an orphan starting at age 15, but he was related to John Taylor, so I wonder if John Taylor took an interest in him. When the family reached Nauvoo in 1842, the prophet Joseph Smith was among those who came to the landing to meet the immigrants. George Q. recognized him at once, as readily as though he always had been acquainted with him, though he had never seen even his portrait. In Nauvoo, George Q. became a member of his uncle's family, and as Elder Taylor was publishing a paper, the young man learned the printing business in his office. There you go. He, John Taylor basically finished raising him. Yeah. Even though he wasn't his child, yeah. He was his wife's nephew. Interesting. I don't know that I knew that. At least I didn't remember it. Interesting detail. I did know that he was involved in the printing business. When the Latter-day Saints were compelled to leave Nauvoo in 1846, Elder Cannon traveled with the main body to winter quarters, and the succeeding year crossed the plains, arriving in the Great Salt Lake Valley October 3, 1847, being one of Utah's pioneers, whose arduous labors he shared cheerfully. 2 years later, he was called to go to California, and while there, in 1850, he was selected with others for a mission to the Sandwich Islands, where he landed on December 12, 1850. I heard that he actually talks about being one of the first groups to enter Utah. It wasn't the first. They came in July of 1847, but he came in October of the same year. Just a couple months later. The Hawaiian Islands mission emphasized a prominent trait in Elder Cannon's character. The missionaries had expected to preach to the white population, but the opportunity to do so was very limited, and most of the elders were in favor of returning home. Interesting. Had expected to preach to the white population. I wonder why. There weren't that many white people in Hawaii at the time, if I'm not mistaken. Elder Cannon was impressed by a sense of duty to preach the gospel. He could not feel that he had performed his part by stopping at the very threshold of his work. He had put his hand to the plow and was not ready to turn back without making the furrow. The white people would not listen, but the native population was in need of gospel teaching, and Elder Cannon determined to do his part in supplying that need. He informed his companions of his purpose if he had to remain alone, and though he might not baptize one soul. His unflinching devotion to duty and unwavering faith that the Lord would bless his labors were the means of a great triumph in disseminating the gospel message among the Hawaiian people. 4 elders remained with Brother Cannon, and in 3.5 years, there were over 4,000 members of the church on the islands. That's amazing. The elders had to learn the language, an accomplishment that came with remarkable ease to Elder Cannon, who also translated the Book of Mormon into the Hawaiian tongue. I did hear about this. Yeah, he's pretty well known for speaking fluent Hawaiian. Like that's just crazy to me. Like, how many people from England speak fluent Hawaiian? I'm just saying. I'll bet there's not that many. Returning from the Sandwich Islands in the summer of 1854, Elder Cannon assisted the late Apostle Parley P. Pratt for several weeks with the latter's autobiography, and then came on to Salt Lake City, where he was made one of the presidents of the 30th Quorum of 70, and shortly afterwards was notified to prepare for a second mission to the islands. Oh, they're going to send him back to Hawaii, huh? Was he married at this point? I don't think so. Before the time came for starting in response to this appointment, Elder Cannon was called on a mission to California to assist Elder P. Pratt in the publication of a paper. He left Salt Lake City on May 10, 1855, and on reaching California was set apart to preside over the missionary work in that state and in Oregon, while Elder Pratt came to Utah. The publication of a paper, the Western Standard, and the fulfillment of duties involved in the mission were a task which called for all of Elder Cannon's mental and physical energies, and these were willingly devoted thereto. Besides the labors connected with the Western Standard and the responsibilities of the mission, which had to contend in that day with severely adverse circumstances, Elder Cannon published the Book of Mormon in the Hawaiian language. Didn't he say that he already did? Oh, no, he said he translated it. Okay, so now this time he made sure it got published. That's good. The work being attended with great difficulties. When it was done, the news of the approach toward Utah of the Buchanan or Johnston's army was received, and in obedience to counsel, Elder Cannon closed up the mission affairs and returned home, reaching Salt Lake City on January 19, 1858. On his arrival here, Elder Cannon was appointed adjutant general in the army, being organized for defense against invasion, and engaged in that service. Soon afterwards, he was directed by President Young to take a printing press and material to Fillmore, and there issue the Deseret News, which he did from April to September 1858. Now, the Deseret News had already been established, so I'm assuming he was just asked to take it over or move it to Fillmore. Then he was sent on a mission to the eastern states. Okay, so I guess they undid his call to the Hawaiian Islands, yeah, I guess. The call for this reached him at Payson, and he was returning from Fillmore to Salt Lake City, and in 3/4 of an hour he was ready to start. Good job. The speedy preparation was remarkable, but his promptness was not a surprise. It was a rule of his life to be on hand at the call of duty, and to lose no time in unnecessary delay. Time with him was too precious to waste. The Eastern mission was of a delicate nature. So much prejudice against the misinformation concerning the Mormons prevailed, that the task of helping to correct the false impressions existing had to be performed judiciously to be effective. Elder Cannon engaged in the work with characteristic zeal and energy, and, by means of letters of introduction from the late General Thomas L. Kane and others, was able to meet many leading editors, members of Congress, and other public men. I'm sorry, I thought I misread that. I had to read it like 4 times. And to present to them the true state of affairs in Utah. Besides doing this, he had charge of the branches of the church in the East, and in 1859 and 1860 acted as church emigration agent, in which position his careful attention to detail made his services highly valuable and satisfactory. Yeah, but I'm sure he left right after that because that was the beginning of the Civil War, yeah? While on this mission, Elder Cannon was selected October 23, 1859, to fill a vacancy in the Council of Apostles, occasioned by the death of Elder Parley P. Pratt. And on his return home 10 months later, August 26, 1860, he was ordained an apostle and became one of the 12. He was then 33 years of age. Soon after his ordination, he was called on a mission to Great Britain, and on December 21, 1860, reached Liverpool. A short time subsequently, he established the church printing office in that city. Returning to America in May 1862, Elder Cannon went to Washington. He and Hon. William H. Hooper, having been elected senators from Utah, in an endeavor to have the territory admitted into the Union as a state. In July 1862, Congress having adjourned, Elder Cannon again went to Europe, and presided over the mission there until 1864. In the autumn of that year there was an Indian war in the United States, and the journey over the plains to Utah was attended with many perils, but was made in safety. For the 15 years preceding the death of his arrival, more than 14 years of Elder Cannon's time had been spent in missionary labors away from home. To return to his own residence from the mission field was not with him to lay aside the harness he had worn in teaching the gospel. His fixed purpose was to be ever onward in the path of progress. There was ample opportunity to instruct and encourage the saints at home. There were thousands of the youth who needed to receive the same testimony of their parents had obtained, of the divinity of the gospel restored to earth, that they might in turn be valiant in its behalf and enjoy its blessings. In the winter of 1864-65, Elder Cannon organized a Sunday school in the 14th Ward, Salt Lake City, and by the first of the year, 1866, he was ready to enter the larger field of educating the youth through his experience and ability as a writer, as well as by his voice and immediate example. In January 1866, he began the publication of the Juvenile Instructor, which we have been reading. The magazine is now in its 35th year, and it is not boasting to say that it has been a great power for good among the young people, notwithstanding the many and onerous duties that have fallen to the lot of President Cannon since 1866, some of which have required his absence from Utah. The periods when he was when he has not given the juvenile instructor his personal attention, have been few and brief indeed. In connection with the work of the Sunday schools, which this magazine espoused from the first, Elder Cannon was made general superintendent of the Deseret Sunday School Union in 1867, and has acted in that position up to the present. Not long since he stated in public that he knew of no work in life that had given him greater satisfaction than his association with the cause of training the young people in the paths of righteousness and true knowledge. In educational matters he was connected not only with the Sunday schools but with the public school system, being at one time Chancellor of the University of Deseret. He is also actively engaged with the church schools. In referring briefly to what Elder Cannon has done as editor, author, and publisher, it may be mentioned that in 1867 he received another appointment from President Young to take charge of the Deseret News, then issued weekly and semi-weekly, and while in the capacity of editor he instituted the publication of the Deseret Evening News. Again, in 1877, in company with Elder Brigham Young, Jr., he was in charge of the Deseret News for a time. He is also author of the Standard History of the Prophet Joseph Smith, and of several small works, one of them being My First Mission, the initial volume of the Faith Promoting Series. The publishing house of which he is the head has issued a vast number of publications of the better class. In the way of business enterprises, Elder Cannon has taken a very active part. He was associated with the founding of Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, also known as ZCMI, and is now the only surviving member of the original board of directors of that great organization, in which he is still an officer. He has also been connected with railways, banks, and other financial and industrial enterprises to promote the business welfare and development of the Intermountain region. In 1871, he was sent east on another mission to aid in correcting false impressions that were being created against the Latter-day Saints. In August 1872, he was elected delegate to Congress from Utah Territory, a position to which he was chosen 5 consecutive terms. He had had experience as a legislator in Utah and in Congress, though he had no voice or vote on general legislation. His judgment and advice were sought after and valued by members of his associations in the national legislature. Owing to strong prejudice against the Latter-day Saints, he had numerous trying and even exciting experiences in Congress, but he had made many warm friends to the national capital and accomplished much for the people of Utah. Finally, in March 1882, the outcry against the Latter-day Saints culminated in the passage of a law which rendered him ineligible to the office of delegate. This was the Edmunds Act, disenfranchising those who practiced polygamy as a religious right. Before retiring from Congress, however, he had the opportunity of speaking in vindication of the people of Utah, and under the trying circumstances discharged his duty with boldness and emphasis, yet with diplomatic delicacy. By the will of President Brigham Young, who died in 1877, George Q. Cannon, Brigham Young, Jr., and Albert Carrington were named as executors. The settlement of the estate required much attention and was a source of considerable worry. In 1879, suit was begun by a few dissatisfied heirs, and Judge J. S. Borman made an order increasing the bond of the administrators. As this rule by the court was a travesty on justice, the executors refused to obey it. They preferred the prospect of an indefinite term of imprisonment to submitting to the imposition required of them, and were committed to the penitentiary. After 3 weeks' imprisonment, Chief Justice Hunter, who had newly assumed the duties of office, set aside the unjust requirement and restored them to liberty. Soon after this, the intricacies and difficulties of settling the estate were proceeded with till the administration of its affairs were closed. The presidency of the church was exercised by the Council of Apostles from August 1877 until October 1880, when the first presidency was reorganized. Apostle John Taylor was elected president of the church, his counselors being Apostles George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith. Twice since then, in 1890 and in 1898, the first presidency has been reorganized, the changes being rendered necessary by the death of President John Taylor and President Wilford Woodruff, respectively. In each organization, the choice has fallen without hesitancy upon Elders Cannon and Smith for counselors. The selection in the first presidency gave President Cannon still further opportunity for the exercise of his notable faculty of counseling and of meeting the spiritual duties to which he had advanced by a life service. Nowhere has his influence been so potent for good or so far-reaching among the people as in association with his brethren in this capacity. His career in this respect is a powerful example to the youth of the inestimable value of a steady, conservative, vigorous, and strict adherence to duty, whether in the humbler or higher ranks of society, in achieving success in life. In the year 1884, there began a specially persecutive assault on the Latter-day Saints, particularly aimed at the plural marriage feature in their religion. Owing to the intense bitterness of some who were engaged in this raid, it was felt, from the promptings of experience, to be advisable for the leading brethren of the Church to avoid coming directly within the power of the persecutors. There was not likely to be, toward men, less prominent the violence that characterized the days of Carthage jail. That's a bit much, yeah? But to the leaders, the severe result was almost certain, unless something was done to avert it as far as possible. The desirable end was attained, though President Taylor died in exile. President Cannon was specially harassed and passed through many close places, but finally the fury of the persecutive storm began to spend itself. I don't know that persecution is an adjective. Persecutive? I've never heard that word before. The spirit of the law, itself severe in these cases, became predominant, and President Cannon and other leaders met the issue as early as it was reasonably safe for those in their position to do so, and were subjected to fine and imprisonment. President Cannon served 4 months' term in the Utah Penitentiary. The prison life of those who were thus incarcerated was no stain upon their character. It became a credit mark of their fidelity to their convictions of right. The experiences of President Cannon, as may be seen readily from a brief review thereof, have included so many hardships that wear on the physical being, and so much that draw on the intellectual faculties, as to impress an observer with the fact that it must have been a remarkably powerful physical and mental organization to bear up successfully under the pressure. In Brother Cannon's case, in that of other notables among the leading men of the Church, a potent factor that has contributed to this success should be noted by the readers of the Juvenile Instructor. It is that the subject of this sketch recognized his mortal tabernacle as given him of God for a holy purpose, and that his duty was to take the best care he could of it under the circumstances he was placed in. This he ought to do, and notably in connection with the word of wisdom, he has contributed years of his life by observing the counsel of God given by revelation to the saints. President Cannon has had severe attacks of illness, and there is not a doubt that his career on earth would have been closed long since if he had been less mindful of the rules of health. All men cannot reach old age through the best care they can give themselves, but the readers of this magazine can learn from President Cannon's example how not to shorten their lives, but to prolong them to the fullest extent for good and joy to themselves and associates. Even with the necessary brevity of a magazine article, this paper would be incomplete without making reference to an element that has entered largely into President Cannon's success as a writer and speaker, in public and in private. He has sought successfully for that polish, grace, and understanding of words that enable him to express his thoughts forcibly, clearly, and in plain language that the people generally comprehend. He exhibits a careful avoidance of mystifying phrases and unwieldy words. His aim is to use language as it should be used, to convey lessons of truth and beauty. But this manipulation is to an extent mechanical, intelligently so, as the act of a skilled workman in securing and handling the best tools for his purpose. Back of it all is the pure and deep earnestness of a sincere soul which devotes the full energies of its intelligence to the task at hand. When he converses or writes or preaches, there is in President Cannon's every word and sentence the living fire of an intense earnestness, always in full measure for the occasion, always wrought up to that point which yearns for greater strength from divine inspiration, and does not yearn in vain. The limit of space for this imperfect sketch is reached. May the interest in its lessons be but thoroughly awakened, and it will have served its purpose. James H. Anderson. Okay. Whew. That was intense, yeah? I will admit that I found it very conspicuous that something kind of major life event was completely left off. They didn't mention any of his wives or any of his children, which I find rather neglectful because one of his children became an apostle, yeah, another one became presiding bishop, yeah, and then later an apostle. So like honestly, you missed out a whole section. Like I would have appreciated at least a paragraph about it. So let's ask Alexa, how many wives did George Q. Cannon have?
George Q. Cannon had 5 wives.
5.
He was a leader in the church and practiced plural marriage.
Mm-hmm. Alexa, how many children did George Quayle Cannon have?
George Quayle Cannon had 8 children with his wife Sarah Jane Jenny.
Okay. You just said he had 5 wives, so hang on, I'm going to have to Google this because Alexa doesn't seem to know the answer. Here we go. There we go. And here we go. In the years between his 2 Hawaiian experiences, Cannon married 6 wives and fathered 43 children. Thank you. That's what I wanted to know. Oh, it's so frustrating. Okay. And what's more is Alexa was wrong. It wasn't 5, it was 6, and he fathered 43 children. Hang on. 43, that's from BYU Studies, but on Wikipedia it says 33. Okay, so then he left Hawaii. Returning to Utah Territory, Cannon married Elizabeth Hoagland, daughter of Abraham Hoagland and his wife. He was immediately called to assist Apostle Parley P. Pratt. Yeah. Was that his first wife? Hang on. Yeah, that was his first wife. Okay, Cannon practiced plural marriage and was married to 6 women. It doesn't say when he married the others, though, so that's a little bit irritating. Yeah, apparently he did go to prison. Yeah, he was arrested under the Edmunds-Tucker Act, and there's a picture of him in prison from 1889. Yeah. Yeah, I also found it very interesting. So Cannon died in April of 1901, and then Lorenzo Snow died in October of the same year. So if he had lived a few months longer than Lorenzo Snow, he would have been president of the church. Just putting that out there. So it's interesting that he died just before his death. It says he fathered 33 children, but then the BYU Studies one said 43, so I don't know which one is correct. I can't judge that one, but yeah, some of the prominent ones are Abraham H. Cannon, who was an apostle. John Q. Cannon, I believe he was in the presidency of the 70s? Is that right? Oh, presiding bishopric. Okay, my bad. He was a counselor in the presiding bishopric. And Sylvester Q. Cannon, who was presiding bishop and then later became an apostle, if I'm not mistaken. Let's double check that. Sylvester Q. Cannon, presiding bishop, associate of Quorum of the 12, and then Quorum of the 12 Apostles. There you go. But significantly later than his other siblings who were general authorities. So I think he was significantly younger than them. He was born in 1877, whereas Abraham H. Cannon was born in 1859, so he was a lot older. Yeah. And then John Q. Cannon was born in 1857. So he was 20 years younger than his 2 brothers, who were also general authorities. Yeah. Anyways, plus there's a bunch of other people too. Utah's first U.S. Senator, Frank J. Cannon. Yeah. Lewis T. Cannon and Georgius Y. Cannon became prominent architects. And then if you go farther down, more of his descendants, you get Howard Cannon, U.S. Senator from Nevada. Chris Cannon is a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And George I. Cannon became a general authority of the church. Although when that was, I don't know. That's just what Wikipedia says. He was born in 1920. He must be the grandson. Oh, great-grandson, yeah. So his paternal grandfather was Abraham H. Cannon, who was George Q. Cannon's son. So, yeah. And he served in the first Quorum of the 70 from 1986 to 89. So, and he passed away in 2009. That's interesting. His great-grandson of George Q. Cannon just died in 2009. I feel like there's been so many generations already. You know, like George Q. Cannon himself had died in 1901. Anyways, found that really interesting. The BYU ROTC celebrates touchdowns with Cannon named George Q to honor him. Of course it does. Oh, that's so funny. Okay. Anyways, I find him a really interesting person. And I feel like if you want to like qualify his life, I would call it like quick obedience. You know, he was a ready man. You know, you asked him to do something and he jumped up and did it. And I think that that's a really great quality. I'm still curious about the shade that the other person who was asked to write about him threw in the article, who was like, you know, he had flaws and some of them were really strong, and it was really strong because, you know, he's such a good person otherwise, but you know, but we can ignore them because of all the good he does. It's like, whoa, what did he do? You know, gosh. I have no idea. I have no idea what he was referring to. So, like, if you read the articles on him, it doesn't really seem like there's a major problem. Yeah. Who knows? Anyways, I also found that very interesting that he was basically raised by his uncle John Taylor. I mean, not completely, but from his teenagerhood until adulthood. So, yeah, like that's kind of amazing and it's kind of impressive. So, anyways, I hope you found that interesting, just like I did. Hope you learned something today. And make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.